Guys, I'm Paul Ryan, your host of the ATB Fantasy Show. If you're new to the show, thank you for joining us. And to our regular listeners, welcome back. Of course, my host tonight is none other than Mr. Dave Hartman, a.k.a. Pigskin Papers. Dave, how are you?
I'm doing well, Paul. I'm not that big of an NBA fan, but everyone should know since we're recording this live at 10 o'clock Eastern, there's a game 3 somewhere late in the third quarter. So I promise not to look at my phone to get any score updates. And hopefully people are cutting away from that to listen to us, or they can listen to us anytime on a recorded version of this show tonight. I like the NFL way more than I like the NBA, so I would rather be here with you talking football and fantasy football than watching game 3 of the NBA Finals.
Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're a Knicks fan, yeah?
Yeah, I'm a Knicks fan, so I haven't watched my team in a finals game since 1994, which I don't know if you were even born then, Paul. Probably you were a baby or something like that.
I was still a little wet behind the ears, but I was here.
Okay, good. Yeah. Are you a Mavericks fan?
Oh yes, sir. Big Mavericks fan. I went from Dirk to Luka, so not a lot of people can say I've had that blessing, if you will, to have two franchise players in back-to-back decades.
Yeah, well, for me that would have been like Walt Frazier to Patrick Ewing, and then the Knicks have not been good since Ewing retired or since he left the team. So it's been a long time. The Knicks, it's a story for another day. I mean, they're better now. They've made the playoffs the last 2 years, but they have been a badly mismanaged franchise. And the thing about it is, when the Knicks are good, which has been few and far between in most of my adult lifetime, there's nothing like going to a Knicks game at Madison Square Garden. I mean, it's just electric.
Oh man,
the city is so hungry for the Knicks to be good, and to rally behind them, but it's just been a long time. So hopefully they're kind of on the upswing now, but we'll see.
My second favorite team is the Knicks, and I hated seeing Jalen Brunson go to the Knicks, but I'm glad that he had a good year.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how they do next season. Like I said, hopefully they're on the upswing finally.
Well, guys,
go ahead, Paul.
As I said, guys, this is not a basketball podcast. Don't get it confused. Dave and I we haven't seen each other in a while, so we're just kind of catching up here. But Dave, before we get into our discussion tonight, let the people know where they can find you on Twitter.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm at Pigskin Papers. Both of those P's are capitalized, and you can catch my articles at thepigskinpapers.com, which is my fantasy football and NFL blog. And Paul, where can people find you on Twitter, and where can they get at your content?
Yeah, guys, you can find me on Twitter at Paul_Ryan15, and you can find most of my content on Twitter. If you're a Cowboys fan, you can find the podcast page at Across the Cowboys, and also on YouTube at Across the Cowboys. And of course, I've got the fantasy content here with Dave. You can find that on YouTube as well at ATB Fantasy Show. And I haven't started writing yet. I'm really itching to get back into the writing groove, but you can find my past writings at King Fantasy Sports, which is actually oddly enough, it's I believe it's an England-based fantasy site. So I thought that was kind of cool when that guy reached out to me to give me the opportunity. Shout out to Rich for that.
Excellent, but no Premier League stuff, right? It's all all NFL.
I can barely spell Premier, let alone talk about the sport, Dave.
Fair enough. Well, so far we've talked about basketball and soccer, or football,
yes, sir.
Call it in the rest of the world. But tonight we're going to talk. We're going to start with a bunch of NFL stuff. Just talk about the NFL offseason and looking into the coming season, and then we'll shift somewhere around the middle of this show and do some fantasy football as well. So let's jump right in, Paul.
Yes, sir.
We'll start in the NFC. Which NFC team do you think has had the best offseason since February, since the Super Bowl?
Dave, I was doing research for the pod, and There's some teams, man. There are some teams that I felt made a lot of improvements this offseason, but we're talking strictly NFC. This was kind of hard, but man, I got to give it to Chicago. When you look at what they did, they got a bona fide wide receiver one for Justin Fields, in addition to getting him help on the offensive line with the additions of guard Nate Davis and rookie tackle Darnell Wright. I really liked what Chicago did.
They're my number two answer, by the way, because I just thought that you knew they weren't going to stay at the first pick,
Right.
because they have Justin Fields and they've seen enough out of him, I think, to at least give him another year, kind of like what the Eagles did with Jalen Hurts this year. They weren't 100% sure, but they'd kind of seen enough to give him one more year to prove himself. And they got a lot for that first pick, and then I thought they drafted pretty well. So they were my number two. My number one is the Philadelphia Eagles. And, as someone who likes the Giants as kind of my number two team, I hate to say it, but, the Eagles represented the NFC in the Super Bowl last year. So you wouldn't expect them to be able to improve their team that much. But because of, good trades they've made in the past, they had that extra first round pick in this draft. And for them to get Jalen Carter, who a lot of people had as maybe the best just pure football player in this draft.
Yeah.
And to put him in a situation where he's surrounded by his Georgia Bulldog teammates. They got a lot of veterans in that front seven who will, I think, help keep him in line, keep him focused. They rotate players there a lot. But not just that, they kind of made sure that they didn't lose key pieces from the team. They got Jalen Hurts signed to a good extension that I thought was, kind of they didn't pay the Deshaun Watson guaranteed money price. They kind of gave him, he and Lamar kind of got similar deals. I just, the Eagles have been doing it right for a while. There's a reason they've been to 2 Super Bowls in the last 6 years or whatever it is. And I just thought that they had a strong offseason. They also, DeAndre Swift and Rashad Penny have been hurt a lot, both of them. But getting both of them, I think sort of assures that they'll always have one of them healthy. Plus, they have Gainwell and Boston Scott. I just think they improved their team, and they were already a really good team. So they get my top grade in the AFC.
Yeah, and you look at
in the NFC.
The price they paid to acquire DeAndre Swift, a 5th-round pick, and what they paid Rashad Penny to sign there. They're building the running back room kind of the way that the modern NFL needs to start doing that without giving out those big time contracts.
Yeah. And look, if both of those guys stay healthy, I mean, you picture those two in the backfield with Jalen Hurts, who might have led the NFL in rushing touchdowns last year. If he didn't, he certainly did if you count the postseason. That could be just a scary, and then you got Devonta Smith and A.J. Brown and Dallas Goedert and a good offensive line. If they're all healthy, good luck.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're talking about the NFC teams that made the most improvements, Dave. When you look at the AFC, which team did you have making the most improvements this
year? My first, I was going to say the Jets, just because they were such a disaster at quarterback last year, and bringing in Aaron Rodgers, even though he's going to be 40, I think could, make a big difference for them. But I'm not going to say the Jets because I don't love the rest of their offseason. I'm going to say the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think they had a fantastic draft, getting Joey Porter in the second round. A lot of people thought he was a first rounder, and they got the big tackle in the first round. And then, they added some kind of like sneaky free agents. Like some of these guys are a little old, maybe like Patrick Peterson, linebacker Cole Holcomb. I just thought they kind of quietly, they also brought in Allen Robinson, who I know the last couple of years he's done nothing, but I think having, one more veteran receiver there will help Kenny Pickett. They're such a well-coached team, and they're always good. So to see them have a good, and so my two answers are the Pennsylvania teams, right? I got the Eagles and the Steelers, but that AFC North is a tough division. but the Steelers, even last year when they shouldn't have been, they were kind of in it. They still were over 500, which they've been every year that Mike Tomlin has coached there, or they've been at least 500. I really like their offseason. Who is it for you?
Well, it's funny you mentioned the Jets, Dave, because I know that they didn't make the most improvements, but I think it's safe to say they made the biggest improvement for me, and that I'm going with the Jets, Dave. A team that was literally a quarterback away from being in the playoffs last year went out and got a Super Bowl winning 2-time MVP winner in Aaron Rodgers to pair with Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall, and an elite defense. I mean, I know they might not have had they should have probably added to their offensive line, but man, I mean that's a scary team to think about if Aaron Rodgers, can click early.
Yeah, no, that's fair, and that's why when I first started thinking about this question, I had scribbled down the Jets, and then I thought about it some more and researched it some more, and came up with the Steelers. So every team this time of year has question marks. Except for maybe the Eagles and maybe the Chiefs and teams that went really deep last year and kind of are bringing back most of their roster. So we'll stay in the AFC since we were just talking about the AFC. Which AFC team do you think has the most question marks right now at this point in the offseason and kind of heading into training camp?
For me, David, it has to be the Denver Broncos. After everything they traded away for Russell Wilson, in addition to the contract they gave him, while also going out and getting Sean Payton and investing a first-round pick in him. I like when teams take risks, but this season is the biggest of Russ's career and maybe Payton's too. I just, I still have a lot of questions about that Denver team. I'm not sure what to expect after what we saw from Russell Wilson and just kind of the history of him not really gelling with his teammates, you hear all those discussions about what type of person he's like off the field as far as kind of being like entitled and snooty and everything. I don't know. I'm not sure what to make of that Broncos team in that tough AFC West.
I like your answer better than the one I'm about to give. And now that I've heard you talk about the Broncos, because I think that's probably the right answer. I came up with two teams. For me, I think the Patriots have a lot of questions going into this season and beyond. Mac Jones, of the quarterbacks in that class, he probably showed the most promise as a rookie of the 5, quarterbacks that went in the first round from that class. But he took a big step back last year, I thought. I mean, to the point that at one point he was sort of benched. And then he was hurt, then he was benched, then he came back. So that's a big question for them because this is kind of the key year for him in his third season. And then I think sort of long-term, the question of how long Belichick wants to coach there. He's chasing Shula's record, and clearly he wants that. But this is one of the worst teams, at least on paper, and compared to the rest of the division that he's had. They're used to being the top dog in that division, and a lot of people have them now as the fourth team in that division. They haven't really improved the wide receiver group that much. And I think there's a lot of questions there about the sort of the long-term post-Brady era for that team. And I think the other team I thought about is the Raiders. I've been reading some stuff recently that Jimmy G might have some lingering injury issues, and might not be ready for the start of the season. They don't really have anything behind him. Josh McDaniels really hasn't gotten it done as the coach there. They're in that tough AFC West, with the Chiefs and the Chargers. Waller's gone. Devontae Adams is great, but and Josh Jacobs is, coming off a phenomenal season. I just don't know where that team is headed. I don't know if they're in a rebuild or not in a rebuild. So I think they have a lot of questions heading into this season too.
Those are two good ones. I'm actually pretty excited to see what the Patriots do because last year, there was a lot of questions last year, but when you think about the offensive coordinators, having two offensive coordinators and Matt Patricia and Joe Judge, who were not very good offensively when they were head coaches in Detroit and New York, respectively. I think that's a team to look out for, because you look at that defense. They went out and got a stud defensive end. I forget his name. They're in the first round, and then I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but they got an elite defensive back in Chris Rodriguez too, to pair with Jack Jones, and I forget who the other defensive back is for the Patriots. That they've always had a strong defense, and then they add those two pieces. I mean, I like what the Patriots did, and I'm excited for Mac Jones and kind of getting a fresh start. And I think Tyquan Thornton and Juju Smith-Schuster, that's going to be a nice pairing.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to remember too about the Patriots last year is they had that dumb experiment with their coaching staff and didn't really have an offensive coordinator. And I think Belichick realizes, that whole thing was a disaster. So that's sort of another question for this year. Like, will their coaching staff actually coach?
That's a good point, yeah.
And how will that all work this year?
Yeah, for sure. So, Dave, we're talking about the AFC team with the most questions. Moving along to the NFC, which team do you think has some questions need to be answered this offseason, or heading into 2023, rather?
Yeah, I mean, this may not be the right answer, but for me, a team I'm really interested in seeing what they look like this year is the Vikings. Who were sort of the darlings last year, but when you peel back the onion, they won all of those one-score games, and their record has easily been under 500. I think a lot of people looking at that NFC North now would say the Lions are the team to beat, not the Vikings, who won the division last year. It looks like they're probably going to let Dalvin Cook go. That's everything I've been reading. And, Alexander Madison has always filled in admirably, but I heard this stat on a podcast. He's got something like 400 career carries, and only one of them has gone for more than 20 yards. So he's a plotter,
Wow.
Not a game breaker. They really need, I mean, they do have Hawkinson, but they really need to hope that that Addison or someone else, Osborne maybe, can really step up as a second receiving option. I think this is kind of effectively the last year of Kirk Cousins' current contract, so they're going to have to figure that out, sort of long term. And I think he's maybe 34 or 35. Eric Kendricks, who's kind of manned the middle of their defense for a long time, is gone. And so, look, they made the playoffs last year, which was great. They had that ridiculous comeback against the Colts, which was like nothing anyone's ever seen. And they had all those crazy wins, like the one in Buffalo. But can they do that again? Or was their record way better than who they were? And then they lost to the Giants, in the playoffs. Not that the Giants were a bad team. I mean, I think everyone had that as a pretty close game, but for this season to be a success for them, they need to win the division again and win a playoff game. And I don't think they can do that. So they're my answer.
I like that answer, man. That's surprising. I never really, looked too deep into the Vikings last year, but I really like that answer, Dave. For me, I'm looking at the NFC team that has the most questions, and I think the easy answer would be Arizona when you look at everything that's gone on with them this offseason. But I'm going to shock the world, David. I'm going to say the Detroit Lions. Reason being is
interesting.
The Lions are headed down the right path, and they were the darlings of the 22 season after their appearance on Hard Knocks. However, they failed to meet expectations during the season and had one of the worst defenses in the NFL. If Detroit were to miss the playoffs again, they could clean house and start a mini rebuild in 2024.
That's interesting. I like that answer. All right, let's talk about coaches for a second, because it seems like coaches these days don't necessarily get more than 2 years or sometimes 3 if they're in a new situation and they're not getting it done. There's obviously a few coaches in the NFL like Pete Carroll and Bill Belichick and Mike Tomlin and Andy Reid, who are super safe in their jobs. I would say Sean McDermott too, and there's probably a couple of others. But what coaches do you think could be on the hot seat this season as we head into the 2023 season?
For me, the head coach I think is on the hot seat. It has to be Brandon Staley of the Chargers. You look at the wild card matchup last year, that epic second half meltdown versus the Jaguars. It's time for Staley to prove that he's the right coach for the franchise quarterback in Justin Herbert.
Yeah, he's on my list. I actually have quite a few coaches that I think. I think Robert Saleh on the Jets. With all they've done to build that roster.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of have everything in place. I mean, I think Joe Douglas has done great as their GM. They've drafted very well. They've had, they traded Jamal Adams and got all those picks and made good picks with them. Now they've brought in Aaron Rodgers. I think Saleh could, if the Jets underperform, if they're like 6-11 or 7-10.
Oh, wow.
And then I think some of the names you'd sort of expect to hear, Dennis Allen, Todd Bowles, maybe Josh McDaniels, maybe Ron Rivera. And then I'll give you one name that I know you probably don't want to talk about, and that's Mike McCarthy. Now, I don't know if he's necessarily on the hot seat.
Yeah.
And the Cowboys have been a playoff team the last couple years. But, they haven't – I mean, they did win a playoff game last year, so that's pretty big. But I think if, the Cowboys were to miss the playoffs this year, and just knowing who their owner is – I mean, he's stuck with Jason Garrett a long time, so maybe it's crazy for me to say that McCarthy could potentially be on the hot seat. And you're the Cowboys expert, so I'm just curious what you think of me even saying that.
No, I mean, you bring up an interesting point, because you look at the last two seasons, there's that feeling of not exceeding expectations. You look at the San Francisco game last year, that was a winnable game that we came up short. You look at the game the year before, where I think everybody had Dallas as the better team, and we just got outplayed, out-physicaled. And then you've got Dan Quinn, who's kind of right there looking over the shoulder, who's had head coaching opportunities himself, being presented to him. I mean, if I think, it's probably NFC title game or bust for Mike McCarthy this year, but yeah, I wouldn't say he's on the hot seat, but I think he kind of might feel the heat,
Yeah, especially with that owner. I think with that owner, you're feeling the heat all the time. And he's more involved in the day-to-day stuff than most owners, so we'll see.
But man, Mike McCarthy, compared to what I dealt with from Jason Garrett for 10 years, I mean, McCarthy's been a breath of fresh air.
Clapper. A lot of clapping.
Okay, Dave, quarterback is so important in the NFL. When you look at the quarterback landscape, is there one that you think has the most to prove this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's got to be Tua, and I think he proved last year that he can play when he's healthy, and especially with all those weapons they have. Yeah. But I think not only does he have to prove that he can stay on the field, I think if he can't stay on the field and the reason is head injuries, that this could be it for him. One big concussion this year, and that could be it. And I also think the Dolphins need to see the kind of production he was putting up early in the season for a longer stretch of games, and him kind of leading the team. And the reason I say him is because, he's in that same draft with Burrow and Herbert and Hurts. And the only one of them that's been extended so far is Hurts. And the reason for that is that Hurts went in the second round, right? So there's no fifth-year option. So for Hurts, he was about to be playing his fourth and final year on his rookie contract. The Dolphins have, I think, already extended Tua. And Burrow and Herbert are in the same boat because they were first-round picks. But I think this is sort of the season that will determine whether the Dolphins extend Tua and try to stick with him. I mean, we know they were trying to get Brady before this past season. So they can keep saying they're sold on Tua, Tua's the guy. But in his 3 seasons, he's missed games every season, and he's had bad games, at times when he's healthy. Last year, he was better. I mean, he was really good at times when he was healthy. So For me, the answer is two. I mean, a couple other names I'll just throw out there without any explanation. Russell Wilson, who you mentioned before, I mean, last year was bad. So he's at that age, he's the same age as, I guess, like Tannehill and Cousins. They were all in that same draft. I think Deshaun Watson, he didn't do much. He looked bad, but he hadn't played in almost 2 years. So I think, he's got something to prove this year. And Mac Jones, who I mentioned already. I hope I didn't take your answer by giving some extras. Who's your guy?
Surprisingly, you didn't. And in the quarterback that I think has the most to prove, and I'm saying this, I don't think he has anything to prove to me, albeit I'm not an NFL GM, but I think it has to be Justin Fields. Now, again, I'm saying I think he's a franchise quarterback. The question is, does Chicago, and it sure didn't kind of seem that way with the rumors of Chicago potentially taking a quarterback at one before trading it away, and smart minds questioning if he can make the throws necessary to win in the NFL. I think Justin Fields not necessarily has something to prove, but I think he needs to quiet the naysayers, if you will.
Fair enough. Let's stick with quarterbacks for a second, because a name that didn't come up is Brock Purdy, who kind of proved himself over 7 games that were just a crazy run like we've never seen. It was like Linsanity, talking about the Knicks again. To see sort of a guy who like no one had ever heard of, and all of a sudden he's winning games every night. Do you think he did enough at the end of last season that he should just sort of be, walk in as the QB1 there and kind of he's already won the job, or should there be a bona fide quarterback competition in San Francisco this summer?
Well, in a situation like San Francisco's, I think there should be a competition, Dave. Purdy was great last year, but as we've seen, most quarterbacks can do what he did in Shanahan's offense and scheme. So when you gave up the package you did to trade up for and draft Trey Lance, I think you have to give him a shot to win the job.
Fair enough. I mean, it's kind of a crazy situation, right? You have 3 quarterbacks there. 2 of them were the number 3 overall pick in an NFL draft. And they walk in as the number 2 and 3 behind the guy who was the last pick in an NFL draft. It's just like, you couldn't write that, I don't think. It sounds fictional, but that's the case. I mean, you've got, and Sam Darnold, I think has, I think he's there as an insurance policy. The irony is, as you just said, he could probably start in a Shanahan system and look great. For me, I think it's more about the injury. Purdy had a serious injury to his elbow. So I think there should be a competition this summer, if for no other reason that he needs to prove that he can still throw the way he did. Because he elected not to have Tommy John surgery when, it was sort of unclear whether he needed it. He's had 4 months now or 5 months. I don't know I haven't really been tracking this. I don't know how much he's been throwing, but I think given the injury he's coming off, of course, Trey Lance is coming off a very serious injury also, which I think is why they brought in Darnold. I mean, they have 2 guys who are coming off injuries. So I think there should be a competition there, but I think if Purdy can throw, it'll be his job, at least to start the season.
Agreed. Sticking with the quarterbacks here, Dave, there were 3 first-round quarterbacks taken in this draft. You look at Bryce Young, C.J. Stroud, and Anthony Richardson. We've heard camp reports that Richardson's been taking snaps with the second team. Bryce Young took some snaps with the second team, and I believe also C.J. Stroud. But when you invest that kind of high draft capital in a quarterback, do you think they should compete for the starting job, or do you think it's already theirs to lose?
I think the NFL has changed a little bit. The best quarterback in the league right now sat for a year, right? Mm-hmm. The best old quarterback in the league right now, which is Aaron Rodgers, who's won 4 MVPs, sat for 2 or 3 years. Tom Brady was a 6th round pick, so no one was expecting him to start right away. And he got to start because of an injury, but he didn't play as a rookie. But times have changed. When Peyton Manning started right away as a rookie, people were like stunned. that, you were throwing a rookie out there to the Wolves. And especially because often these highly drafted rookie quarterbacks are often going to bad teams, right? That's how
Yeah.
they get them, right? So you don't want to throw them out there to the Wolves when they don't have a good offensive line and they don't have good receivers or whatever the case may be. But I think that's all changed. I mean, if you look at recent years, very few rookie QBs taken, in the top 5 or top 10 picks don't start right away. And I think whatever's happening in camp right now, if you look at those 3 teams, it's not like any of them have, a really good quarterback to play ahead of the rookies. And I think they'll want to get reps right away to these players. I mean, I look, the Colts, of the 3 teams, I mean, the Colts have a pretty good roster and are maybe the most able to compete right away. Although the Panthers are in a bad division, so who knows? But I think they will all be. I think they'll all be starting week 1, barring an absolutely terrible training camp for one of them that just shows they're not ready or an injury. What do you think?
No, I agree. I think it really is theirs to lose. We've seen enough from Davis Mills to where I think C.J. Stroud is the starter there, no doubt. And with Bryce Young, and I believe he's competing with Andy Dalton. I feel like we've seen enough from Andy Dalton the last couple of years to know that it's Bryce Young's job to lose. And with Richardson, I feel like that's where the most questions is. He has the most upside of any quarterback in this draft class. It sounds like what most people who analyze prospects would say, but there's just been so many questions about his throwing ability and his accuracy and everything that I could actually see there being a really legit competition between him and Gardner Minshew.
Right. That's fair. I mean, he's, the comp for him, I think, is Josh Allen, right? Because when Josh Allen came into the league, he had a howitzer for an arm. He's a really good runner, but he wasn't an accurate passer in college. I mean, now the knock against him was, that his completion percentage was low, and he wasn't playing against great competition because he wasn't in one of the big, college conferences.
Right.
That's something they worked on with him. And, thankfully they had great coaching for him in Buffalo and he got better. It took a couple years, but I think getting those early reps was important for him. And so, the Colts, we'll see, but I'd be surprised if it's not Richardson week 1.
Yeah.
I think, unless they think it's got the risk of ruining him or setting him back because he's really that far away from being ready. But from things I've read, a lot of the stuff about his his accuracy and stuff like that is overblown and maybe a little bit reflective of the fact that they didn't have a great roster down in Florida.
Right.
And he wasn't playing on a particularly good offense that was sort of, that his throwing wasn't as bad as people are saying. He just didn't have really good players to throw to. So
that makes sense.
We'll see. All right. I think we're at the point of the show where we are going to switch over and talk about fantasy football, which I know both you and I are, I do most of my writing about fantasy, and I think you do as well. But, one of the things I love about doing this show with you is that we like to talk about both.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things you talk about, I mean, it's funny what you were saying about Justin Fields, because I agree with everything you say, and none of that, he's fantasy gold, right? Like,
oh my goodness, yes.
His value, and it sort of like hurts going into last season. Like, you knew the fantasy value was there. You didn't know how good he could be from an NFL perspective, and he proved it. And, it'll be interesting to see if Justin Fields can do the same thing. But you kind of know he's going to be a great fantasy asset again. So let's start with a team we touched on briefly earlier, which is the Raiders. Paul, are you worried? The Raiders have some good fantasy assets around their quarterback, or at least they have Devontae Adams and Josh Jacobs, and then they have some other, sort of fairly decent receivers behind Adams. Are you worried about that offense with Jimmy Garoppolo coming over to replace Derek Carr.
So I wasn't really worried when the signing happened because of Garoppolo's relationship, his at least familiarity with Josh McDaniels back to New England, and being familiar with the system that he ran and everything. When the report came out about his foot, I did start to get concerned. But I was listening to a podcast. These gentlemen were drafting a best ball team, and they were talking about Devontae Adams and should people be worried and everything. And apparently the Raiders kind of knew about the issue with Garoppolo's foot and how they worked that into the contract. That's part of like the I guess the non-guaranteed part of it, where if he's not healthy, he won't get paid anything. And knowing that they knew that and they still signed him, and I understand that he's not practicing or anything right now, I'm not that excited about the Raiders offense, but I wouldn't say I'm worried either.
Interesting. I mean, last year, people who drafted Adams got him at a discount, right? Because even though Derek Carr has been a prolific passer and was his college quarterback, I think people just looked at, going from Aaron Rodgers, who, Adams, I think, led the NFL in target share percentage, like 3 of the last 4 years that he played with Rodgers. I mean, It was like a funnel offense at times. If Rodgers needed a first down, that's where the ball went. And so I think, people downgraded Adams a little bit last year. And so the people who drafted him were rewarded because his numbers were just as good pretty much as they had been. I think this year there's reason to be a little more worried about that. Just, I think Jimmy G, from a fantasy standpoint, I mean, we've seen him, certainly Debo 2 years ago put up really good numbers, but a lot of that was rushing. I mean, he put up good receiving numbers too, and had a lot of receiving touchdowns and yards. But I don't think Jimmy G has quite the history of supporting fantasy receivers as Carr does over the last 5-6 years. Certainly Jimmy G has worked with McDaniels before, and if he's healthy, that should be fine. The question is, what if he's not healthy? Because they really don't have much behind him. I guess the question is, do you think Tom Brady's phone would ring, and do you think he would answer it if Josh McDaniels calls him because Jimmy Garoppolo can't play, which would be the ultimate irony, Brady coming back out of retirement to replace Jimmy G. What do you think about that?
No, I know that was a story that was kind of starting to develop, but Brady was pretty quick to nip that in the bud.
Yeah,
I mean, it's crazy to think that he wants to own the Raiders. He doesn't want to play for them. He wants to own them, which I find interesting.
And I think that if you'd need permission, I think, from the other owners to both be an owner and a player. I think the only way you can do that is if the league votes on it. Not positive about that, but I thought I read that in a piece in the last week. I don't think Brady's playing in any way, shape, or form this year. I think he meant it this time when he retired.
Yeah.
But it's a fun thing to think about, and the Raiders would be the obvious place if Jimmy can't go. Because again, if he can't, I don't know what they do. They don't really have. I've looked at their depth chart, and I can't tell you who else is on it because it was names I didn't really know.
Yeah, Aiden O'Connell was somebody who was getting
Brian Hoyer. I guess they have Brian Hoyer, but I think he's a coach too.
Is he a coach player? Is he doing? I think
he's like a player coach kind of thing.
Man, I haven't heard that name in a while.
I know. Well, he's got that Patriots McDaniel bloodline also. So
yes, sir, he does. So Dave, again, you mentioned that this is a fantasy show, or should be a fantasy show. It's in the name here. Well, when you look at the quarterbacks, is there one that you're targeting that you would want on all of your fantasy teams?
I'm glad you asked that, because I posted an article earlier this week where I talked about, one of the things I talked about is that I'm rethinking the strategy of waiting on quarterback, which I've been a big advocate of the last few years, because I think there's a lot of depth at the position, but I also think that there are like anywhere from 3 to 6 guys who are in a tier I think it's 2 tiers. The top 3 of Hurts, Mahomes, and Allen in whatever kind of order you want to put them, and then a second 3 of Burrow, Lamar Jackson, and Justin Fields, just because of what Fields did last year. Where I kind of want one of those 6 guys. I think I do think that last year, if you took the advice and waited because you thought, you could load up on other positions and then just get Brady or Rodgers or Stafford, kind of like prolific passers who'd be going a little later, or Russ Wilson, you had a problem. And so I'm kind of thinking that it's worth this year, maybe using a little more draft capital to get one of those kind of sure thing studs at quarterback. I'm still thinking about this, and obviously in a super flex league, I'm definitely doing that if I can. I'm using a first round pick on a quarterback almost every time. But to give you a specific, and then there are a couple names that if you want to wait, I do like Tua, but I think if you take Tua, you got to take someone else like a Jared Goff or Cousins, like someone who's not going to hurt you for when if Tua gets hurt.
Yeah.
But I do, if Tua stays healthy, I do think he can put up big numbers in that offense. What about you? Are there some QBs that you kind of want to have on any team you're putting together?
I'm always tempted to take my guy Dak Prescott, but I don't do that, man. I don't like to have too many of the same players on my fantasy teams or my dynasty teams. But somebody that if I can only pick one, I have to go with Justin Fields. Just the rushing ability, and then the acquiring DJ Moore, and I don't know where all this stuff is coming from that he can't make throws and everything, because I'm very excited for the Bears offense this year.
Yeah, I mean, the quarterbacks who really, really run, and you saw it with like even Daniel Jones last year, they just get so many fantasy points. Like I think in regular fantasy scoring, like a rushing yard for a quarterback is 3 times a passing yard. So if you have a quarterback that can run for between 60 and 100 yards per game almost every game, it's just huge. And especially if they throw in 6 to 10 touchdowns, it's like having, I'm not the first person who has said this, it's almost like having 2 players at the position.
Right.
And then there's, a couple of quarterbacks like Burrow and Mahomes, and maybe Justin Herbert could get into this conversation, but he didn't do it last year. So I'll leave him out of it for now, who just put up such good passing numbers and give you that little bit of like rushing boost. They'll run for 4 or 5 touchdowns and 300 or 400 yards on top of all that passing. And that's why I'm saying, like, I really think that waiting on quarterback, there might be a pretty big differential between, starting an Aaron Rodgers every week and starting a Patrick Mahomes or Justin Fields every week.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, those stud quarterbacks really, I'm all about waiting for quarterbacks in superflex leagues. But, when you have a guy like a Justin Fields or a Patrick Mahomes, I mean, those are week winning guys. So
yeah,
when you can draft them and get them, it really is an advantage.
Yeah, 100%. And I that's why I think it really is time to rethink the waiting on a quarterback thing. And I think the influx of quarterbacks that do so much damage running the ball is what has kind of changed at the position. Let's talk about the rookies for a second. This was not the best draft for like rookie quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, but there are certainly some interesting names out there led by Bijan Robinson. I think he's so attractive as a fantasy asset that I'll leave him off the list. And we're really talking more about, let's just leave this as a redraft league question, because Dynasty League, it's a very different analysis, I think.
Right.
When you're looking at the rookies. So in redraft, what rookie not named Bijan Robinson or rookies are you going to target this year, looking at it right now?
Man, I got to go with Jahmyr Gibbs. You look at the Detroit Lions offense, it's Jared Goff and then Amon-Ra St. Brown, and who after that? They go out and they sign David Montgomery after, and then they trade around DeAndre Swift, and then they use top 10 draft capital on it, or top 12 rather on Jahmyr Gibbs, and then Jamison Williams. He's suspended for the first 6 games. You look at what Jahmyr Gibbs offers as a running back. Really, his best trait is his route running and pass catching ability. Not that David Montgomery can't do those things, but Gibbs is so much better at it. And then plus he has the elusiveness and the speed to go with it. I think he's going to be an early contributor for fantasy teams, and especially in redraft.
Yeah, he's my answer also. And with both Swift and Jamal Williams, who led the NFL at least for running backs in rushing touchdowns last year, that's a lot out the door. And that Dan Campbell bite their kneecaps, blow you off the line of scrimmage. They do like to run the ball when they get inside the 5-yard line. Montgomery's been a pretty good short yardage back in his career, but I think Gibbs will get opportunities, all over the field, and he's my answer too. I guess the other one I'll mention is a guy we talked about earlier, and that's Anthony Richardson. If I can get him late in drafts, just because of what he might be, if I've already got my QB1, I wouldn't mind getting that guy and just waiting and seeing, because he could be a guy that is a week winner, later in the season, putting up, big rushing numbers as a quarterback. So he's the other one I would think about in redraft. I don't think the other quarterbacks are likely to be great. And there's obviously, especially in just one quarterback leagues, it's hard to think that any of the rookies would really be like a top 12 quarterback this year. But Richardson could be a guy you spot start, or, if things break right, that could be worth having on your roster as someone you might get some real upside production out of.
No, Anthony Richardson, that's a great answer, man. I didn't even think about him. That's fantastic.
Oh, I'm gonna throw one more in. I'm gonna give a little plug for my Miami Dolphins. Don't sleep on Devon Achane.
Oh man, yeah.
That guy is a track star on an offense full of track stars, and
right.
I don't know. I mean, look, if they end up somehow with Dalvin Cook, because I know he's like a Miami guy. I think he's from Miami. I think he lives down there. I think he's going to get cut by the Vikings, and the Dolphins, with Mostert, who gets hurt a lot, Achane, who's, not necessarily a between the tackles, like every down runner. Obviously, if they add Dalvin Cook, I'm sort of not interested in any of them, because that would be a very crowded backfield. But I would take a late round flyer on Achane, because he's going to be a threat to take the ball a long way every time he gets touches. So I'll add him to my list. Not necessarily as a guy I'm looking to start, but a guy I'm looking to stash.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, Dave. So, we're getting to that point, actually we're right in the middle of it, really, when we're here in startup season for fantasy players, especially dynasty players, where new leagues are probably starting every day. Best ball leagues are taking place. You're looking at the draft here. Matthew Berry infamously said, you can't win your fantasy league with your first round pick, but you can lose it. When you look at that first round pick, Dave, what position or players should fantasy players be targeting with their round 1 pick?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Paul, because I also wrote about that in my column this week, which you can find at thepigskinpapers.com. And I probably plagiarized Matthew Berry without realizing it, because I kind of made that point that I know I can't win my fantasy league with my first round pick or my early second round pick. But if I blow that pick, I really hurt myself. And it's really for that reason that, and I've always kind of felt this way. Now I prefer auction leagues, so it's a different dynamic, but it's kind of like, where do you want to spend your biggest, the most money you spend on a player. And I'm leaning towards the top receivers over the top running backs. I think if you look back at recent years, they are less likely to disappoint and also less likely to get hurt. The reason to take running backs early in the first round is position scarcity, right? Like there are just fewer running backs that you're comfortable starting every week than there are receivers. But kind of year in and year out, like if you looked at last season, I know Cooper Kupp got hurt, but before he got hurt, he was tearing it up again. And then the other kind of top receivers, Chase missed a few games, but they all kind of delivered. Justin Jefferson, if you drafted him in the first round, you got first round value. Mm-hmm. Devontae Adams, if you took him around the turn, or Tyreek Hill, who actually you could have gotten at a discount. Stephon Diggs. I just think the receivers are more reliable. The running backs, last year a lot of the top running backs did okay, but then some of them didn't. And the year before was a disaster. Like all of the early running backs disappointed. A lot of them got hurt. And the other guy I'll throw in, and I talked about this in my article too, is Travis Kelce. He's such a differentiator at his position. He's so much better on a year-to-year basis than all of the other tight ends. I know he's going to be 34 in October, but if I have a mid-first round pick, all other things being equal, if I'm comparing kind of receiver and running back that I've ranked equally, and Kelce's there, I'm taking a receiver, or I'm taking Kelce over a comparably ranked running back. What are your thoughts about how to play the early picks?
No, I would agree. There's a certain tier of receivers, you mentioned them, Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, that when they're on your team, I mean, any given week, they can win you that week. And there's not a lot of players that can do that. So for me, I'm targeting those stud receivers. I used to be a big weight on receiver, target those stud running backs. But with the way that, the last couple of years that we've seen what these receivers are doing, and how the more teams are going running back by committee, there's not so much such thing as a workhorse. If it's not Christian McCaffrey, then it's a bunch of other guys that are really good, but they're not him. They're not game changers like he is. So target those stud wide receivers.
Even McCaffrey, once Elijah Mitchell came back last year, like they were using him. Like, I mean, McCaffrey just gives you so much upside because of how many passes he catches, but he's not going to get all the rushing work there. And they still have Debo too, who will get some carries in the red zone. So, I mean, the true workhorse back, and going into last season, the guy who looked like the most likely to be a true workhorse back who would get everything was Najee Harris. And people took him with the 6th pick, the 7th pick. And, if you took Stephon Diggs instead of him, or Justin Jefferson, you did a lot better. And so, that's just one example and small sample size. But like I said, I think if you went back and back tested this over the last couple years, the receivers with the really high ADP are way more likely to deliver on their ADP than the running backs with the real high ADP. And part of that is injury likelihood at the two positions. And part of it is a stud receiver is not going to come off the field, right? Like, Tyreek Hill is going to be on the field unless he's hurt, or unless he just caught a 60-yard pass and needs a breather.
Right.
He's going to be, fine. If you're at the 1 yard line, maybe they come off the field when they go run heavy. But, they're going to get the scoring chances, and they're going to get the touch chances all the time. And the running backs don't. So, that's going to be my strategy. I hope everyone in my leagues is listening, so they know exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to have to mix it up now. And swerve, but that's what I'm thinking right now.
Yeah, so Dave, we're talking about receivers kind of being the strength of fantasy teams these days. There's a receiver that's available to all of us here on the free market, and of course I'm referring to DeAndre Hopkins. He's been a fantasy stud for himself for a few years. Is there a team that not named Kansas City or Buffalo Bills that you would like to see him sign for fantasy purposes?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question because he, last couple of years he's gotten hurt a few times or suspended, and he's 31 now, I think. But when healthy, he's still just a really good route runner and strong hands and great sideline receiver. Like he's a guy who can move the chains, make big catches in the red zone and in the end zone. And obviously a lot of teams would like to have him. I mean, my first answer would have been Buffalo. And obviously like I think he's only gonna want to go to a team that can contend. And I think he's, not going to be that easy for some teams to fit under the cap. I mean, because of when he was released, it's after free agency, really. So there may be a lot of teams that can't fit him. I'd put Minnesota on the list.
Oh man,
or Detroit, and especially with Jamison Williams suspended for 6 games. I think both of those teams. I don't see the Packers doing it. And I don't know that he'd be that interested with Jordan Love there at quarterback. But I think any of those NFC North teams actually are ones that I would think about. But the Vikings stand out to me. If you could put him opposite Justin Jefferson and with TJ Hawkinson, and then you got the
Jordan Addison out of the slot.
That'd be and Kirk Cousins, if nothing else, Kirk can throw.
God.
Right. So that would be kind of a fun one, I think. What about you? Where would, for fantasy purposes, where would you like to see D-Hop?
I thought it'd be kind of fun to see him paired up in Carolina with Adam Thielen, DJ Chark, Jonathan Mingo. Rookies sometimes take a little while to get going, but Frank Wright, he's an experienced coach. I know that he would know how to get Hopkins involved in the offense early and often. And Bryce Young being a smart quarterback, I think he would instantly become Young's number one receiver. And I think Young would feel confident that he can, toss it up to him a few times, like give him a 50-50 ball every game and, take his chances with Hopkins of being on the other side. I think that'd be fun. And I look at Carolina, you look at their defense, people could say that they were a quarterback away from making the playoffs. They go on, they get Bryce Young. I think they are my personal favorite to win the NFC South.
That's a good one. How about Cleveland?
Oh man, yeah, they talked about that, but apparently that's already been ruled out.
Oh, okay. Because I was just thinking, like, he had his best years with Deshaun Watson. I'm sure Watson would love it.
Yeah.
You got Cooper on the other side. You also have David Njoku and Donovan Peoples-Jones. That could be, and Nick Chubb running the ball. That could be kind of fun. And I'm sure Watson, if you want to see Watson get rejuvenated, but you saw that was already like not happening.
Yeah, they for whatever reason, I'm not sure if it was financial or what it was.
It could be like I said, it could be hard for a lot of teams at this point to pay for a guy, who's going to command the kind of money that D-Hop is. All right. Well, I think we've covered the fantasy landscape pretty well for purposes of this show, and we're coming up on an hour, so we'll get to our last couple questions here. You're a Cowboy fan. You write about the Cowboys. Are you happy with what they've done this offseason?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to be. That they went out and they got a run-stuffing defensive tackle, something that my co-host Mike Crum from Cowboys Wire has been clamoring about for years. I mean, he was the best run-stuffer or run-stopping defensive tackle in college football last year. They got they upgraded their cornerback 2 position with Stephon Gilmore to pair him with Stephon Diggs to what was already a pretty good secondary. And then they go out and they get Brandon Cooks, the speedster, to add to the arsenal of CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup, and Tony Pollard, just adding another playmaker for Dak Prescott, which, you look at the receivers that we had last year starting, it was kind of a bit of a weakness for the Cowboys after, trading away Amari Cooper, not really getting much from anybody else not named CeeDee Lamb. So I'm pretty happy. I mean, the only complaint I do have is just some questions being at left guard, but it sounds like there's been some some rotation there, or not rotation, but it sounds like our rookie from last year, Tyler Smith, is going to be playing there next to Tyron Smith, which, anytime you can get those two together playing on the same side, I think you got to feel pretty good about that.
Yeah.
Now, how about you, Dave? You're a Dolphins fan. What are your thoughts on the moves they made this offseason?
Well, I wasn't happy that they didn't have a first-round draft pick because they meddled with Tom Brady, and they had traded away their second-round pick or one of their second-round picks to get Bradley Chubb during the season last year. So as far as the draft, they only had 4 picks, and I really like that they got Devon Achane, as I said earlier. But they weren't going to do that much in the draft because they only had 4 selections. But I really liked bringing in Jalen Ramsey. I think that their secondary at times was a weakness last year, and I think he's a little older. I think he had lapses last year, but I think that was in part because the Rams' offense was so bad. He was on the field all the time. And they weren't a very competitive team. I think he still has some really good football. I like that they brought in David Long. He's a good linebacker who can really cover. So I think that they had such a big offseason 2 years ago, bringing in like Teron Armstead and Tyreek Hill, doing everything they could to surround Tua. They brought in other offensive linemen. They've really done a lot in the last 2 years to build around Tua, to see if he's the guy. I thought they had a good offseason, Ramsey kind of being the biggest piece that they brought in. They're in a tough division. I mean, the Jets got better. The Bills are still the best team in the division. The Patriots are just never easy and never easy to figure out. And the whole AFC is tough. They made the playoffs last year, but just kind of barely. I also like adding Mike White. They took him away from the Jets, which was good, because he could have been an option for the Jets. And B, I think Teddy Bridgewater was a pretty unreliable backup last year. Every time Tua got hurt, Teddy got hurt. So I like adding Mike White. I don't think he's great, but I think he's good. And with their receivers, I think he could be very good. You saw what he did with Garrett Wilson last year. Now picture having 2 Garrett Wilsons, or even better, in Waddle and Hill. So I think Miami's set up well. I really think so much is going to come down to Tua's health. It's such a question mark whether he'll be able to stay on the field.
Yeah, that is really the only question about Tua when you saw what he was able to do last year.
All right, so we ready for our bold calls?
Yes, sir. Here we are with bold calls, off-season edition. All right, Dave. So give us a bold take that you have, where what is something you think will happen this off-season that will affect the NFL and or the fantasy landscape as well.
All right, I think my answer isn't quite an answer to that question. This is sort of my bold call for the season, because the off-season is sort of, I don't know that much more is going to happen this offseason besides stuff we can't predict, like an injury or someone beating someone out for a position. So I'm just going to go right to the season. And my bold prediction is that Bijan Robinson leads the NFL in yards from scrimmage as a rookie, which I don't think has happened in a long time. I just think, they run the ball a ton. I think they're going to want to, they don't really have, it's interesting because they've used the top 10 pick on a tight end, a receiver, and a running back in the last 3 years. And I think they want to build that kind of offense that Arthur Smith had in Tennessee, where you're leaning on the running game, and the running game is so good that when you run play action and you've got these targets like Drake London and Kyle Pitts, they're going to be open. For big plays. And I think Bijan's going to catch a lot of passes. And I think he's a special talent. And there are other running backs there, but I think he's going to get a lot of opportunity. So that's my bold call. What's your bold call?
Yeah, I touched on it earlier, but my bold call is I think the Carolina Panthers signed DeAndre Hopkins, and he's the missing piece of returning them to the playoffs.
All right, I like it.
All
right.
Dave,
So go ahead, Paul. You do.
Yes, sir. Before we get you out of here, Dave, again, remind the people where they can find your content and what you're working on this offseason.
Yeah. So I'll be hoping to write about an article per week for most of the next couple months. Most of it'll be draft strategy kind of stuff for redraft. I'll have rankings. I'll have players I'm targeting, players I'm avoiding, that kind of content, similar to what I had last summer. You can always find my articles through tweets at Pigskin Papers. And my blog, again, where all the articles are posted, is thepigskinpapers.com. And then during the season, I'll have weekly fantasy and NFL content. How about you, Paul? Where can people find you, and what will you be up to content-wise this summer?
So every Monday, guys, you'll be able to find me streaming live on Twitter, on YouTube with my guy Mike the Pig Crumb. That'll be our Cowboys podcast. And then hopefully, Dave and I will be returning to this every week, talking fantasy with you guys either on Wednesday or Thursday night. And I don't know when I'll be able to start writing again because my wife and I are about to be going on a road trip to go see her family for a family reunion. But I will start writing again soon. I'm just not exactly sure when, so I don't want to give you guys a date and not be accurate on that. So you will be able to find my writing on Twitter is where I share it, and it's going to be on the King Fantasy Sports website.
Excellent. All right, Paul. Well, this was a lot of fun, as it always is. And I can't wait till we're back on the air doing it again.
Yes, sir. Dave, before we get you out of here, remind the people they can find you on Twitter.
Yep, at Pigskin Papers, and both of those P's are capitalized.
Guys, I'm Paul Ryan. You can find me on Twitter at Paul_Ryan15. We appreciate you joining us, and we'll see you guys next week, hopefully.